Rain hammered the metal roofs like impatient fingers. The storage facility smelled of dust and old rain. Elena Ward unlocked Unit 23 and froze at the ruin. A carton lay collapsed, glass glittering like fallen stars. She whispered, "I thought I sealed this." Her phone buzzed, and a new voicemail blinked like a small heartbeat. Jonah Park said, "Call me back, I heard something strange." Elena played the message with a shaking thumb. Marcus Hale said, "There are things you should never open." His voice carried the chill of November. A locket lay cracked, and a photo bled at the edges. She felt the years close in like slow water. Ruth Avery once said, "Grief will wait until you stop." Elena said, "Not tonight." The corridor hummed with fluorescence and memory. She gathered the fragments, careful as prayer. Dawn pressed a gray shoulder against the city, and Elena walked home with the pouch in her pocket. The world felt quiet, but her ribs rattled with echoes. She set the locket on the kitchen table like a verdict. She said, "You will not win today." The kettle began to murmur, simple as mercy. Jonah called again, and worry rode his voice. Jonah said, "Meet me, tell me what you found." She stared at the window where rain drew soft lines. Ruth Avery had once left a note under the magnet. The note read, "When you cannot hold the ocean, hold one drop." Elena felt that drop now, heavy as stone. She opened a drawer and found the photo sleeves. She said, "I will rebuild what I can." Outside, the light grew, thin, but honest. Elena met Jonah at a corner cafe that smelled of citrus and old books. Chairs scraped like small storms. Jonah said, "You look like the night would not end." She smiled without warmth, but it held. She showed him the pouch and the cracked locket. Jonah said, "Marcus called you why?" Elena said, "He thinks doors must stay shut." The barista set down 2 cups, and lids hissed. A child laughed behind them, like a bell in fog. Elena said, "There is a letter he fears." Jonah nodded and kept his voice low. Jonah said, "Then we open the right one." She looked at the rain and felt a hinge move. The cafe hummed, and time loosened its grip. On the walk back, a cab slowed, and a face in the rear seat glanced up. Marcus Hale watched with a stillness that felt deliberate. Elena said, "He is ahead of us." Jonah said, "He is only noise if we choose." The city breathed in gutters and vents. A street violinist bowed a long, aching note. Elena touched the cloth pouch and felt the grit of glass. She said, "The letter is a key we never used." Jonah said, "Then find the lock." A bus sighed to a stop like a tired animal. The violin hung in the air, and the note stayed with her. She felt a dare rise, quiet and exact. Evening folded the apartment into soft blues. Elena cleared the table and laid the fragments in a careful ring. She said, "I will not fear the voice." She played the message once more and listened for what it hid. Marcus said, "Leave it buried, Elena." She caught a tremor that did not sound like power. She whispered, "You sound tired, Marcus." Silence gathered in the corners like moths. She taped the photo edges to a new sleeve. Ruth's note rested nearby, a small lighthouse. Elena said, "Tomorrow, I meet Ruth." The rain thinned to a fine lace, then stopped. The city breathed out, and so did she. The sky turned a bruised gray as Elena entered her apartment, the pouch heavy in her pocket. She laid the fragments across the table like bones. Jonah called, his voice rough with urgency. Jonah said, "Marcus will not stop now." She replied, "He already began years ago." She pressed the locket against the photo sleeve and felt the paper strain. A memory surfaced, sharp as glass, Ruth's voice saying, "Secrets rot when buried too deep." She whispered, "Maybe they already have." The silence in the room thickened, broken only by the kettle's hiss. She watched the steam rise and scatter, like ghosts unable to hold form. Her chest felt locked, her breath shallow. She said, "It is not just memory. It is a wound still bleeding." She closed her eyes, the sound of the rain tapping its rhythm against the windowpane. The cafe door chimed when Elena entered, damp hair clinging to her cheeks. Jonah sat already waiting, worry drawn deep into his features. He said, "You look like you fought a storm." She answered, "The storm is inside." He reached for her hand, and for a moment she let him hold it. She pulled out the pouch and set it between them. Jonah whispered, "This is not just debris, is it?" She said, "It is a map of every lie." The barista moved in the background, clinking mugs, unaware of the weight between them. Elena said, "Marcus does not warn, he commands." Jonah frowned, his voice steady. Jonah said, "Then we break command." Her eyes held his, tired but burning. Marcus appeared like a shadow that could speak. They found him leaning against the alley wall, cigarette burning low. Marcus said, "You opened what should stay closed." Elena's spine stiffened, but she held his gaze. She answered, "It was never yours to guard." Jonah stepped forward, voice tight. Jonah said, "You fear what truth makes of you." Marcus smiled, thin, smoke drifting. Marcus said, "Truth only ruins. It never heals." His eyes glinted like knives in weak light. Elena said, "Then ruin is already here." The alley smelled of oil and rain, silence stretching taut. Marcus crushed his cigarette under polished shoes, leaving ash like a warning. At home, Elena replayed Marcus's words, each syllable cutting deep. She sat on the floor, fragments spread like constellations. Jonah paced, restless, fists clenching. Jonah said, "He wants you trapped in silence." She replied, "He wants me erased." The lamp hummed softly, the only sound in the room. Ruth's old note lay by her knee, edges curling with time. Elena said, "She told me once, truth is a river, you cannot dam it forever." Jonah crouched, his hand brushing hers. Jonah said, "Then let it flood." She looked at him, eyes glistening with exhaustion and a fragile hope. The night pressed heavy against the windows, but inside something stirred alive. Morning came with bruised clouds and sharp wind. Elena stepped outside, coat buttoned tight, pouch hidden close. Jonah walked beside her, silent but steady. He said, "Where are we going?" She replied, "To Ruth. She is the only one left who knows." The city streets yawned awake, buses groaning, horns blaring. Marcus's words still rang, but Elena felt a shift inside. She whispered, "He cannot hold me in his silence." Jonah looked at her, nodding once. Jonah said, "Then today we break it." The air was raw, biting against their faces, but her stride grew stronger with each step. The day demanded more than fear. The wind dragged low clouds across the river, and Elena stood on the pier with the pouch. The boards creaked like tired lungs. Jonah said, "Tell me everything you fear." She said, "I fear what the letter proves." A gull cried, and the sound cracked. She held the locket as if it could answer. Jonah said, "Then we face it, not later." She remembered nights Ruth sat silent by the window. The silence had always meant more than words. Elena said, "Someone forged a memory, and I lived inside it." She tasted iron, old and stubborn. Jonah said, "Trust me when it breaks." She nodded, but the nod was thin. The river kept its secrets and moved on. They reached Ruth's apartment, a hush held by books and plants. Ruth opened the door with hands that had known long winters. Ruth said, "You brought the shards back." Elena said, "I brought what they left me." The kettle clicked and memory rose like steam. Ruth said, "Marcus learned to lock pain behind tidy doors." Jonah watched the old photographs on the wall. He said, "Who stood behind the camera?" Ruth did not answer at first. She set 3 cups down and looked at Elena. Ruth said, "Your mother asked me to hide one letter." Elena felt the room tilt. She said, "Hide, not burn." Ruth nodded and did not blink. Ruth lifted a box from a high shelf and set it down with care. She said, "Your mother feared what truth would cost." Elena's breath shortened like a string pulled too tight. Jonah said, "Cost was paid anyway." Ruth opened tissue and revealed an envelope. The paper had the color of old wheat. Elena said, "Has Marcus read this?" Ruth said, "He begged to, and I refused." The air changed shape around them. Elena traced the seal and felt a tremor pass. She said, "If I break this, the past moves." Jonah said, "It will move either way." A siren wailed outside and faded to nothing. Elena stepped to the window to breathe. The city moved in lines and rain. Jonah joined her and lowered his voice. Jonah said, "You do not have to carry this alone." She said, "If I hand you the weight, it still stays mine." He nodded and did not argue. He said, "Let me stand under it with you." The words landed like a shelter. She felt her shoulders loosen for a moment. Elena said, "When this ends, I want the sound of quiet rain." Jonah said, "Then we build a place for that sound." The envelope waited on the table, and time pressed close. The door rattled, and Marcus entered without invitation. His presence cooled the room. Marcus said, "That letter belongs to the dead." Elena said, "It belongs to the living who were lied to." Ruth stood between them with quiet bones. Ruth said, "You do not command this house." Marcus smiled like a blade. He said, "You will break what little piece remains." Jonah took one step forward and held the line. Jonah said, "Peace was broken long ago." Elena set the envelope on her palm. She said, "I choose the break that heals." The room held its breath as the seal waited. Elena broke the wax seal, the sound sharp as a crack of thunder. Inside, the letter unfolded like a wound reopening. Her mother's handwriting shook across the page. It said, "Marcus was never guardian, only thief of truth." Elena's breath quivered, eyes tracking the words that stripped years bare. Jonah leaned close, whispering, "It was never you, it was him." Marcus's jaw tightened, color draining from his face. Ruth's eyes carried a grief aged by silence. Elena said, "You hid the choice, Marcus, not the truth." He stepped forward, but the weight of the letter held him still. The air in the room thickened, each word carving a scar into the night. Elena whispered, "I finally see the pieces you broke." Marcus staggered back, the letter's truth breaking his calm mask. He said, "I carried her silence because she begged me." Elena replied, "You carried it to control, not to protect." Ruth's hands trembled as she whispered, "I should have burned it, but I could not." Jonah stepped forward, steady but fierce. Jonah said, "Silence is not mercy, it is a chain." Marcus's eyes glimmered with anger, but also something weaker, fear. He said, "Truth ruins families." Elena answered, "Lies ruin more." She laid the letter on the table like an offering that could not be ignored. The room seemed to tilt, history pressing against its walls. Ruth lowered herself into a chair, her voice breaking like dry wood. Ruth said, "I carried her request, but it hollowed me." Elena touched her hand softly. Elena said, "You kept me alive in her absence, even with silence." Ruth's eyes filled with tears not shed for decades. Jonah said, "You loved her by protecting what she feared, but Elena deserves the truth." Ruth whispered, "She thought truth would drown you." Elena's eyes watered, her chest rising unevenly. Elena said, "It nearly drowned me not knowing." Marcus turned away, jaw set, but his eyes betrayed shame. Silence pressed on them all, heavy as years buried beneath stone. Jonah broke the silence, his voice quiet but unyielding. Jonah said, "Elena, you are not bound by what they chose for you." She looked at him, eyes brimming but resolute. Elena said, "I choose to hold what broke, not to hide it." Marcus scoffed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Marcus said, "You will regret this." Elena rose, clutching the letter. Elena said, "Regret is smaller than lies." Ruth reached for Elena's hand, whispering, "Your mother would have wanted you strong." Elena whispered back, She gave me more strength than she knew. Jonah moved close, his hand brushing hers in quiet solidarity. The air in the room shifted, a storm quieting before another breaks. Elena said, "I see now. The villain was never the truth, only fear of it." Marcus's lips parted, but no words came. Ruth whispered, "Your mother would be proud." Jonah said, "Now we choose the path forward." Elena folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into its envelope, not to hide but to carry. She pressed it against her chest, breath heavy but steady. She said, "This is mine now. It cannot be stolen again." The rain outside slowed to a hush, as if the world paused with them. The silence no longer suffocated. It waited. Night spilled across the river like ink, and Elena walked the pier as if tracing an old scar. The envelope rested against her ribs with stubborn weight. Jonah said, "You have not slept." She said, "Sleep is waiting for an answer." Wind combed the water into restless lines. Ruth had called and left a soft plea for caution. Ruth said, "Do not go alone when the dark is speaking." Elena breathed and thought of years spent second, guessing every silence. She said, "If I turn back now, the lie wins again." A gull drifted low and vanished into fog. Jonah said, "Then I am beside you if you fall." She let that vow settle like a hand on a shaking door. The city lights trembled on the current, fragile and bright. She said, "This is the price of opening." The night did not argue. They reached Ruth's door at dawn, where lamplight held the dark at bay. Ruth opened with a weary smile and a steadier spine than yesterday. Ruth said, "You look like truth has teeth." Elena said, "It bit, and I bled, but I am still here." Jonah set a thermos down and studied the old frames on the wall. He said, "Your mother kept looking past the lens, as if seeing a future that would not arrive." Ruth nodded with a grief that softened nothing. Ruth said she wanted love without consequence, but life charged its fee. Elena held the envelope higher, as if the paper could answer. She said, "Tell me where the last key is." Ruth motioned to a cedar box beneath the window. Ruth said, "In there with the names she could not say aloud." The morning thinned, and courage thickened. The cedar lid lifted with a sigh like an old confession. Inside lay a key and a folded map of the storage facility. Elena said she drew her own escape and never used it. Jonah traced a route with his finger, careful as a prayer. Jonah said, "Unit 7, not 23. Ruth sat down as if the news had weight. Ruth said she hit a second room, hoping the first would mislead. The wind knocked once at the glass like a warning. Elena said, Marcus knew only half the maze. A car engine idled outside, patient and low. Jonah said, "Then he is already moving." Elena closed the cedar box and felt a sudden steadiness. She said, "We go now before the day decides for us." Ruth stood and pressed a small pendant into her hand. Ruth said, "For strength you already own." They reached the storage grounds as rain began like a rumor. The guard booth stood empty, lights blinking without witness. Elena said, "Unit 7 will tell the part he hid." Jonah kept pace, scanning the corridors. Jonah said, "I will watch the line behind us." The lock on the door resisted, then relented with a tired click. Inside, the air tasted of cardboard and cold iron. A steel trunk waited under a tarp like a sealed mouth. Elena said, "If this holds her last truth, I will carry it." A shadow stretched across the threshold and did not belong to them. Marcus said, "Step away from that trunk." He sounded less certain than his words. Jonah stepped toward the hinge with squared shoulders. Jonah said, "You are late to your own story." The rain turned harder, like applause for the inevitable. Elena lifted the tarp and set her hands on cold metal. Marcus stepped in, eyes a storm he could not calm. Marcus said, "You will destroy what little peace remains." Elena said, "Peace is not silence you forced on grief." Jonah moved to her side and held the lid with her. Jonah said, "We open together." Marcus reached out and then stopped, The letter's truth caught in his throat. Elena said, "Stand with us or stand aside." The trunk opened on photographs, tapes, and a ledger of names. Air shifted as if a window had opened inside time. She said, "This is the cost she counted, and the path she marked." Jonah nodded, face set like a vow. Jonah said, "Now we carry it into day." The storm outside found its rhythm, and so did her heart. The storage unit swelled with tension as Marcus stepped forward, his shadow cutting across the open trunk. He said, "Close it, Elena, before it swallows you." She met his glare, voice steady. Elena said, "It already swallowed me. Now I climb out." Jonah moved closer, his presence firm like a shield. Jonah said, "You lived by fear, Marcus, but it ends here." Marcus's eyes burned, jaw clenched against crumbling resolve. He shouted, "You will tear this family apart." Elena answered, "No, you already did. I am piecing it back." The rain outside turned into a furious drum, as if echoing their storm. Every breath felt like a strike between collapse and courage. Elena lifted the ledger, its pages heavy with names. Her hand shook, but her voice did not. She said, "These are not ghosts, they are truths." Marcus lunged, trying to snatch it away. Jonah stepped in, pushing him back with a sharp shove. Jonah said, "You will not touch it." Marcus spat, "You think love will save you, but love is weakness." Elena turned, eyes burning. Elena said, "No, love is what makes me stand when silence tried to bury me." Her chest rose and fell, but her grip never loosened. The moment split like glass, sharp and irreversible. The struggle snapped into silence when Ruth appeared at the doorway, rain dripping from her coat. Ruth said, "Enough, Marcus." Her voice cracked but carried steel. Marcus froze, shoulders trembling under the weight of her words. Ruth stepped inside, her eyes steady as stone. Ruth said, "You let pain make you cruel. This is not her legacy." Elena felt her throat close with grief and relief. She whispered, "Ruth, we found what she left." Ruth nodded, her gaze heavy with both sorrow and pride. Marcus turned his face away, shame cutting deeper than anger. The storm outside softened, but inside, the truth thundered still. Jonah placed his hand lightly over Elena's, steadying her as she held the ledger. Jonah said, "The truth lives because you refused silence." Elena looked at him, her eyes softened by the fire inside. She said, "If I must pay, I will, but not in fear." Marcus whispered, "She trusted me, not you." Ruth's voice sharpened. "She trusted all of us, and you betrayed that trust." Marcus's knees seemed to weaken, his mask finally cracking. Elena said, "It ends tonight. You will not chain me again." The unit felt smaller, packed with history and breath, as if every wall was listening. Elena raised the ledger higher, her voice breaking but fierce. Elena said, "This is not just my story, it belongs to every name here." Jonah stepped forward, his tone unwavering. Jonah said, "Then we guard it together." Ruth's eyes filled, her voice soft. Ruth said, "She would have been proud of your courage." Marcus slumped against the wall, silence finally overtaking his rage. Elena pressed the ledger to her chest, her heart steadying against its weight. She whispered, "The broken pieces will not be lost again." The storm outside slowed into a hush, and for the first time, silence felt like peace, not prison. Morning thinned the storm into a breath the city could keep. Elena stood by the open trunk, heart steadier than the night before. Jonah said, "You look like the answer finally spoke." She said, "It spoke, and I heard myself in it." Ruth touched the ledger and closed her eyes. Ruth said, "Carry it, but let it carry you back to living." Marcus watched from the doorway, smaller than his shadow. Marcus said, "I do not know how to be without the lie." Elena said, "Begin with silence that does no harm." Jonah nodded, and the room seemed wider. Elena said, "We end it here, and we start from here." They gathered at Ruth's table, where steam rose like a promise kept. Ruth said, "May Ward asked me to save you from drowning." Elena breathed and did not break. Elena said, "You saved me by staying, not by silence." Jonah read the first names aloud, careful as prayer. Jonah said, "We will contact those who must know." Marcus stared at his hands as if they were foreign. Marcus said, "I cannot return what I took." Elena said, "You can stop taking." Ruth folded the letter with ceremonial care. Ruth said, "Let light keep it, not fear." The house felt lighter, like rain had finished teaching. Elena walked the riverside where memory had once felt like a noose. The wind smelled new, not sharp. Jonah matched her pace without claiming the road. Jonah said, "What will you do with peace when it comes?" She said, "I will not hoard it. I will share it like bread." He smiled, small and true. Jonah said, "I will be here when it stumbles." She touched the pendant Ruth gave and let the river speak. Elena said, "I forgive the years that forgot me." The gulls wheeled, and nothing inside her broke. Elena returned to Unit 23 with new keys and new breath. She sorted the shards into a small glass jar, not as relics but as truth tamed. Marcus arrived and did not cross the line. Marcus said, "I will help notify the names." She met his eyes and held the line kindly. Elena said, "Do it without rewriting." He nodded like someone learning to walk. Jonah said, "We will make copies and archive them." Elena smiled, small and earned. Elena said, "This room will not haunt me again." The light felt clean on the concrete floor. At dusk, Elena set the locket beside the letter and turned off the kitchen light. The city hummed, not as threat but as chorus. Ruth called, her voice steady. Ruth said, "Eat, sleep, then live." Elena laughed softly and let it stay. Jonah said, "Tomorrow we begin the calls." She said, "Tomorrow we begin the rest." She stood at the window and listened to quiet rain that finally felt like music. Elena said, "The broken pieces are mine, and I am whole enough." The night held the note until it became her own.